Fascinating Jobs podcast. I'm your host, Mackenzie Wilson. On this episode of the podcast, I'm sitting down with Allison Feikes, a Congressional Policy Advisor. As always, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen so that way we can grow our community. With that, let's get into episode number 10 with Allison. All right, hello, welcome back. And hi, Allison. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself and what you do to our listeners?
Sure. So my name is Allison Feikes, and I'm a legislative assistant in the United States Senate. So basically what that is most offices take every single issue area that could come up, and we divide it amongst different legislative assistants, and we're sort of like policy advisors. So we look at letter requests that might come in, or bills to co-sponsor, bills to introduce, everything like that. We're kind of the first people who receive those requests and kind of evaluate bills, votes, letters, that sort of thing, and send those recommendations up through the chain. Sometimes they'll go through our legislative director as well and our chief of staff, and then ultimately the U.S. Senator. We have the same thing, same sort of structure in the House of Representatives too. It just goes to the member of Congress.
That sounds really good, and I think that's a good brief overview of what you do. So if you want to give us like an overview of your career path up to today, kind of how you got to where you are.
Sure. So I graduated in 2014 from Western Kentucky University, and afterwards I did a Fulbright, and I taught English at a university in Turkey for a year. I came back to the United States, and I got my master's in international economics and European and Eurasian studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Afterwards, I was doing a fellowship at a political risk consulting firm, and that's kind of what I was looking to do after I graduated. But the firm that I was working for, I was doing this fellowship, and they were very small. They were like 3 guys in an office in Georgetown. They weren't looking to hire anybody on because they were just too small and couldn't afford to, but they were setting me up with all of their friends in DC. And after 6 months after graduation, one of the partners at the firm was like, would you be interested in working in Congress? And I said I wasn't, but at that point I would take any job I could get. Ended up interviewing for a role as a legislative correspondent in the House side. Ended up getting that job, loved it. Within 2 months, I was promoted to a legislative assistant position. I worked for the Congresswoman for over a year, and then unfortunately, she lost her election in the midterms about 2 years ago, and so I had to find a new job, but ended up landing with my home state senator, which has been great.
Wow, that sounds really cool. So I think that kind of begs one of the questions that I was going to ask. So I think you explained a little bit about this, but so like what if the senator or congressperson that you're working for like loses their election? Do you have a guaranteed job, or do you have to go like find one with another senator or
No, you have to go find one with another senator or member of the House. Sometimes, so for instance, maybe like you are in a Republican office and a Republican ends up replacing you because your member of Congress like retired or something like that, then maybe that person who's replacing your boss might want to look at the staff that they had and hire those people onto their new staff. So for instance, I know Senator Isaacson just recently retired, and he did it in the middle of his term, and another Republican went and replaced him. So a lot of his staff ended up interviewing for positions in Senator Loeffler's office. And so many of them are still there, but that's not a guarantee. So people start looking for, even when a Republican might be replacing a Republican or a Democrat might be replacing a Democrat, usually people in those offices will start looking for new opportunities before their boss actually leaves. And so it's the same when you lose an election, and a lot of times because when there's an election loss, you're going from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican. You usually want to stay in the same, because your policy advisors should be sharing the same sort of values and same sort of political philosophy as you. And so it wouldn't make sense to keep on the same people. So usually it's a complete turnover if it's switching parties.
Wow, thank you. That was like a really good overview of what, and I think that's super interesting how like the policy advisors and everybody who, most of the people working in the office also are on the same like political party as the actual representative themselves. So you were explaining in your kind of overview that you kind of started as a policy assistant and now you're a legislative assistant. So could you explain the difference between the two positions?
Sure. So I started as a legislative correspondent, and so the legislative correspondent responds to, they sort, organize, and respond to all of the mail that comes to the member of Congress. Some people kind of get put off by the fact that the member of Congress might not do it themselves, but I mean, we can get up to 3,000 letters a day. And so the idea of somebody, a member of Congress, being able to sort, I mean, we have, I know in our Senate office alone, we have 4 people in that position that sort, organize, and respond to all of the mail. So 4 people, their full-time job is to respond to the mail. So the idea that the member of Congress would be able to do it is a little bit far-fetched just because it takes 4 people full-time to do it. In our office, and then you usually have a full-time person in the House office doing it too. That doesn't mean that the member doesn't see any letters. A lot of times letters are put in front of them. When I'm advising, for instance, on a policy, I might say 89 people in Indiana have written to us on this issue, or 700 people, or whatever number of people have written into us about it. I also have been made aware of policy because any letter in my issue area, even though it's written by the LCs, will go to me to make sure that the policy is correct and for editing and that sort of thing. And so that's another good way to make the team aware of a certain bill. So just because the member isn't in charge of their mail operation doesn't mean that they don't see a lot of those letters, but that's what a legislative correspondent does. And then I was promoted to a legislative assistant, which is similar to a policy advisor, what I was describing before. Right now, my portfolio includes education, labor, pension, Social Security, tax, foreign affairs, and small business.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I like totally mixed up the names there, but
you're totally fine. It's confusing, especially if you're not on the Hill. It's maybe the titles don't even make sense because a lot of people, when they hear that I'm a legislative assistant, think that I do things like, oh, I run coffee and run errands, because they hear the name assistant and they think kind of like a secretary. But we have a scheduler, we have a body man, that kind of split up those roles. And then we have staff assistants who man the front desk, who are the ones answering the phones and running the kind of the front office. So we have different roles, and it doesn't necessarily the titles don't necessarily describe what the job is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. Yeah. So just kind of like branching off of that, what's like one of the biggest challenges of being the policy advisor or legislative assistant?
I think the biggest challenge is just the way that Congress is set up, because it's just extremely difficult to get bills across the finish line and to get them enacted into law. There are people so for instance, we have a couple of years ago, we had like a police reform bill and it took 10 years to get done. Or we had, even the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was the first major overhaul of the tax code in over a decade. And right now, looking at the Higher Education Act, we're supposed to reauthorize the Higher Education Act every 10 years. It was last reauthorized in 2008, so that means at this point we're 2 years behind, and it's not going to get done by this year, so we're looking at 13 years behind its schedule. So it's just taking forever to get bills done more and more these days, because we're even more under a microscope and people are even more divided than they were before. So it just gets really difficult to get bills passed into law. And so that can be some of the frustrating thing is you might be working on something that's not controversial. I feel like I have bills that aren't controversial that have been sitting in the queue for 2 years, and there's somebody who's blocking it for a reason unrelated to the policy that's actually in the bill. And it's incredibly frustrating. So I think that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does sound challenging. And I think that's, again, you bring up a good point that people are kind of more divided now than they had been in the past.
And you see a lot of people just losing faith in the institution, and they're like, I want to leave the Hill because I feel like I can't get anything done. And so this kind of in the job, it can beat down on you that it's impossible to make change or, that sort of thing. And so that can kind of get to people and discourage people. But I'm definitely still optimistic about getting things done and changing the US for the better and that sort of thing. But it can definitely weigh on you because it is a very difficult and tedious process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so I kind of guess segueing away from that, what is your favorite part of your job?
My favorite part is that I get to learn new things every single day. I've always, when before I had like a real career, I was like, I never want to be bored in my job, and I definitely am never bored. Um, People come to us, and it's also coupled with that is meeting people from our district in different industries that you don't even think exist or realize or didn't realize existed, and they come to you with these very convoluted or very specific problems, and it's so interesting to kind of do deep dives on those issues and learn about policies that the intricacies of policies and that sort of thing. So you're just never bored and always learning something new and always meeting new people. And that's my favorite part of the job for sure.
Oh, yeah, that does sound really cool. And I think that's kind of good. So you were mentioning how like people from different like businesses or industries will like come to you guys with like problems that they need solved. So is that something that like they're arguing for, they need a new law to be passed, or how does that kind of work?
It depends. So sometimes it is, they might say the statute is written this way and we want it to be written this way. A lot of it too, especially with COVID-19 happening, most people, and I would say most people who come to us with a problem or wanting something, they usually want money. So they want the government to, give grants to certain organizations, or with COVID-19, we have small businesses coming to us asking for next rounds of the Paycheck Protection Program. That's a popular ask. We have schools coming to us asking for increased funds in higher education or through K through 12, all through COVID-19. But even without the COVID-19, we have an appropriations process every year. And a lot of private organizations, nonprofit organizations, and even public organizations benefit from that appropriations process. And so they come to Congress and they ask for increases to those budgets. But they also ask for a change in law. That happens quite often, the creation of new programs, things like that. But then they might not always be asking for a change in the law. Sometimes they'll be looking at maybe a rule that the administration has implemented, or an executive order, or a policy the administration has implemented, and they want us to write a letter to the president and his administration saying, hey, you guys are carrying out the law this way. We think it should be carried out this way. Or this is the rule that you guys set up. We would like to weigh in and tell you that we think the rule should actually be this way. Or they might even be asking us, please support this rule, or that sort of thing. Sometimes there's people trying to pass laws that are counter to their business operations. And so they'll be coming in not to ask us to implement a law, but to block a law. And that happens quite often. So, or they'll be asking us, a lot of asks too, especially because I'm in foreign affairs, is they want us to write to foreign governments asking them to do something. That's another popular ask. So people aren't just limited to asking us to pass certain laws. There's quite a wide array of tools that members of Congress have. And so they'll ask for maybe a number of different things in that arsenal. So.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting. I didn't know that all of those things were popular asks for people in Congress. That's like actually so cool. So, how do you guys decide who to listen to if they come in and say like, "Oh, I'd like you to write a letter to the president," or do any of those kind of things?
Well, the number one thing that I listen to is how is it going to impact, like we're elected by, or my boss was elected by the people of Indiana. So my first ask is how many people in Indiana are asking for this, or how many people in Indiana will be affected by this? And so that's kind of my main criteria. If you're a company, in Florida and you have no impact on us, then we're going to ask you, well, why don't you go talk to Senator Rubio or Senator Scott, who represent you, or maybe one of your members of Congress in the House of Representatives. So that's going to be the first kind of criteria that I base it on, is who's asking for it, and whether it would maybe your company isn't in Indiana, but there's or maybe you're headquartered in Delaware, but you have a plant in Indiana that employs 50 Hoosiers, then that's going to impact our evaluation. The other thing too is I'm just also trying to see whether it aligns with the senators' ideas and values. Usually people are asking for such specific policy that it's a pretty complicated answer of whether it might align with what his vision is. Other times it's quite obvious. And so it's easy for me to either shut down or pass along to my bosses and that sort of thing. So,
Wow, yeah, that seems really cool. And like I think that it's really interesting how you guys kind of like filter out those different asks. So, as you were kind of mentioning, alluding to a little bit before, things have been pretty different, especially in government because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, how has that kind of affected you guys at, at the office of the senators and stuff like that?
yeah, so right now we're only going in, half of our staff goes in on Monday and Wednesday, and half of our staff goes in on Tuesday and Thursday. For a long time, we were all work from home at the beginning of the pandemic. I've really upgraded my own personal office, just myself, to make working easier because we have been working from home. Usually we have a lot of face-to-face meetings, and that has turned into phone calls and Zoom calls. Some of that is okay. Some of that can be a little bit frustrating, especially when technology doesn't work as it's supposed to, or, there is value, I think, to face-to-face meetings still. And then the days that we are in the office right now, there still aren't visitors being allowed in the Capitol. So even when I'm working in the office, which is nice to have my desk, and it makes things easier because you still have to introduce bills as well as co-sponsors in person. So for those types of things, as well as my boss has also been going to committee hearings in person. It's really great that we have been going into the office even at half capacity, only 2 days a week. But otherwise, we have been implementing work from home policies. Other things, wearing a mask around the Capitol building. Again, we're not having visitors right now. We're supposed to kind of just stick to the people that are in our office, rather than going, like, we have about 6 different offices with about 4 people per office. So right now there's only about 2 people per office, and we're really only supposed to interact with that other person rather than going around. And little things like no shared food and things like that, those policies have been implemented as well. And that's kind of how we're dealing with COVID-19 as an office. But work-wise, it's actually gone way up. Like I said, we've had some relief packages, and then we've had a lot of debate over further relief packages. And so every time a new iteration comes out, that's our jobs to read the bills and figure out its impact on our stakeholders and constituents. So the work, I know there's like in less demand in some industries, but in the government, we've actually been working overtime to kind of figure out what we need to be doing to react as a government to the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that you guys are staying safe and that you're working really hard to like help everybody in the country. I think that's, just a big thank you from all of our listeners for all of your work on that. So has it been easier or harder to pass like the coronavirus related bills?
I think it's been hard, especially lately, and we always knew it always gets really hard or difficult to pass legislation right before an election. And I think that's what happened here because we weren't able to even pass very, very skinny packages of COVID-19 relief towards the end. And I think that was because, my opinion is biased because I work for a Republican office. So in my opinion, the Democrats didn't want to give any of the Republican offices a win so close to the election. And so they wouldn't even pass kind of the skinniest version of COVID-19 relief, citing that it just like wasn't enough, even though the policies within those skinny relief packages were kind of the policies, the bare bones policies that everyone agreed upon. The other thing too is, it's a strategic thing because if the Democrats win back the House, Senate, and presidency, then they'll want to wait till 2021 to do another COVID relief package because they can pass something like the House HEROES Act, which Republicans took a lot of issues with, and they came back with their COVID relief package, which was the HEALS Act, and they want Democrats basically, if they're able to win back all 3 branches of the government, or sorry, not all 3, the 2 branches of the government, including both legislative bodies, then they'll think that they'll be able to get everything that they wanted. So why would they pass something now when if they just wait till January, they can get everything? So it actually means that If, for instance, Republicans keep the Senate, Democrats will clearly keep the House. I'm not sure if it matters how much who wins the presidency will weigh in on it. But if it ends up being split in some way, shape, or form, then maybe we'll get something done before 2021 because they'll still have to have a compromise package even in the new year. So that's kind of been, the election has definitely been the biggest barrier in getting further relief packages done at this point.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is kind of like super interesting because even though like the relief packages might be kind of helpful, as you mentioned, like the Democrats kind of have like other motives in doing so. So yeah, just kind of like you also like perfectly brought up what one of my next questions would be was with like the upcoming presidential and then like re-elections for elections for members of Senate and the House, have like do things at your job generally like change a lot during that time, or is it like harder, easier?
Yeah, under normal circumstances, we don't, during an election year, we don't work in the month of October because everybody is home campaigning. This year was clearly different because we had the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and we had the COVID relief packages. So that kind of busied our schedule and made us stay in October for much longer than we usually do during an election year. And then again, it just makes things harder, especially when things are up in the air because, the Senate is set up in a way that one member of the Senate can kind of hold up legislation. So even when the Republicans in charge or the Democrats in charge, the other party can make it impossible to pass bills. And that's what they started to do once the election drew closer, because at that point, it made sense to see how the election turned out before they started passing additional pieces of legislation. So it became a lot more difficult the closer we got to the election. And we kind of always knew that. And the other thing, too, is the closer you are to the election, the more your actions will have an impact on how that election will turn out. And so that includes everything from, getting wins for the other party, but also if you're compromising in any sort of way, you don't want to look like you're compromising. The closer you are to the election, the more you want to look like you're standing very firm in your principles or values, whether they be Democrat or Republican. So the election always, the closer we get to, especially a presidential election, the harder it is to get stuff done.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that you bring up a couple good points there. First, with the point that you make about how like senators want to kind of look like firm and stand still, and then secondly, with the point that you make about the Democrats and Republicans, the partisan that we were talking about before. Yeah, so you mentioned that you guys like often get the month of October kind of free to because the senators are campaigning. So is this kind of like a vacation time, or are you guys out campaigning with your senator, or how does that usually work?
So that's a complicated answer. So anytime I should say that we're free or not legislating, what we really mean is we're in recess. When we're in recess, we're still working 9 to 5, and we're usually working for whatever we're going to be doing once we get back from recess. So I know right now we're trying to figure out how we can because once we turn into the new Congress, basically all of the bills that were introduced in the 116th Congress are dead. So we want to get our bills passed before we have to start all over. So we're spending a lot of time strategizing, working. I know we have a hearing coming up once we get back for the lame duck session, so we're preparing for that. A lot of times we get little bit less requests from lobbyists, but we're still meeting with our constituents and that sort of thing. And then the members of Congress themselves, during any sort of recess period, what they're supposed to be doing is going back to their home state or their home district and meeting with constituents there. So for the month of October, right before an election, that's what they're doing. They're back home, they're meeting with constituents, that sort of thing. They might be taking time off to campaign. Now, if staff, whether they're campaigning for their member of Congress or not, that's completely up to them because an office cannot force you to volunteer for your boss. Most people usually want their boss to win because otherwise they wouldn't be working for them, and they usually share the same values and the same sort of political beliefs as their boss, or again, they probably wouldn't be working for them. So most people do choose to work for their campaign. They can't get paid by both the campaign and the office that they work for. So they have to choose one or the other. They either collect a salary from the campaign, in which case they completely stop going into work and take a leave of absence from their job, or they get paid by their office, but they choose to take vacation time, personal days, that sort of thing, and then they volunteer. And again, they can't be forced to volunteer. It's completely up to them. So if you want to stay in DC, you can't afford a plane ticket back to the district, or don't want to take the time, then that's completely up to you. I know in my last office, we had a guy that was in law school, and so he chose not to volunteer on the campaign, and it wasn't held against him. That was totally fine because he couldn't do law school and go volunteer back in our boss's district, and nobody expected him to. So,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that was like a really good overview of kind of like what you guys are doing on a recess. And yeah, I think that's like kind of good, because then I was wondering like, oh, well, like, does that kind of get held against you if you like don't go volunteer for the campaign? But yeah, then I think you kind of cleared that up at the end, which was good. Yeah, so I think I'd kind of like to segue into our next topic of discussion, which is what's one of your favorite like projects or bills you've worked on during your career?
um, well, I have to say that what's been fun about my current office is my boss was kind of new to politics, especially new to federal politics. And so he kind of had a set of values and beliefs that he had. And then he would say, I really want to do a bill on this issue. And we kind of got to pitch him different ideas. And if he liked it, he let us run with it, which was really fun. And one of his campaign promises was about being tougher on Iran. And so there's a bill that he introduced that I kind of got to see from I went to an event and heard about different policy recommendations, and I met with, and then I followed up with experts afterwards, including people at the Congressional Research Service, to look at the evolution of the history of similar policies in the past, and what proposals have existed in the past, if there had been any other similar bills. Was able to work with a couple other stakeholders and that sort of thing to draft a bill, passed it along to different offices to see what they thought, got their feedback, made those changes, and we introduced it. And that's kind of been exciting because it's been a complete, I pitched this to my boss, I got to do it, and start to finish, brand new, never been done before legislation. And so that's really fun. I think that the policy I currently enjoy working on the most is higher education and kind of our student loan system. Right now, the federal government acts as the fifth largest bank in the country due to our student loan portfolio, but we have extremely high default rates compared to the private sector. And so it's because, in the name of being nice to people, we kind of let them borrow what they can't afford, or what's worse is repay it in a manner where they're in negative amortization, which means that their student loans are growing at a rate that's faster than they're paying them off, getting them stuck in these terrible student loan cycles. So I like to look at different policies of how to fix that problem and make sure that people aren't stuck in these in this mountain of student loan debt, and how maybe the federal government, in my opinion, can take a step back from that, or at least implement policies where we're running more efficiently and running more like the private sector, just in the way that we're making sure that people aren't stuck. Because in the private sector, if a bank was doing what the federal government does, it would be considered predatory lending. So we need to make sure that our lending system, which is much more generous than maybe the private sector, also doesn't trap people and make them worse off.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting, and I never even knew about that issue in the student loan sector. So I think that's really cool how you guys are kind of working on all of these different issues, maybe like different from the ones that you're seeing just like blasted to you from the news that they're talking about at all the presidential debates, and I think that's so cool.
Right.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on this in the first part of the answer for that question when you were talking about how you were writing the bill. So are you guys, as the staff, like in charge of actually drafting the bills, or is that something that the member of Congress / representative does themselves?
So that's a complicated question. So, and by the way, too, it depends on what kind of member you work for, because there are members who come in and they say, I want to introduce a bill that does exactly this, or they're very familiar with different statute. That's very common. But nobody, including the member to the staffer, actually writes the bill. So there's an office called the Legislative Council. There's the House Legislative Council and there's the Senate Legislative Council. And those people are non-political positions. They're lawyers, and their entire job is to draft legislation. So what happens is I might email them and come pretty close to writing the bill, and saying, like, this is exactly what I want the bill to do, or this is the part of the law that I want it to amend, and this is exactly what I want it to say, and I want to include X, Y, and Z, and then they actually put it in the correct format. And so, but it is very important that once the Legislative Council returns the bill to you, they're human beings too, so you really want to read over and make sure that that communication wasn't muffled, and so they wrote exactly what you wanted, and two, that there aren't any mistakes, because I've seen legislative council work where there's been a typo, and there have been incidences in the past where typos weren't caught and they were implemented into law and they were executed to that typo. And so that's a big issue. And so that's something that you have to stay on top of. But it's actually the Legislative Council, this nonpartisan, non-political office, that writes and drafts every single bill in Congress.
Oh wow, that's so interesting. I didn't even know that like was a thing, but that's really cool. And yeah, also I thought that was so interesting how you were saying about the typos, how like they actually got put into law. Do you know if it's ever been anything that like, has like changed the meaning of a word, or if it's just been like, they spelled the with a th instead of an e?
No, it's been pretty significant. There was a typo in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in regards to restaurants, and it was mostly restaurants, but it was also any kind of storefront, and when they could write off renovations and upgrades. And I think it was supposed to be something like 7 years. Every 7 years, you can do these remodels, and you can get some sort of tax break from it. And they actually put like 37.75 years. And so that was a big impact on those businesses, and it was corrected. So it has been corrected since then, but even the typos, for a while, we were told not to fix anything because a lot of Democrats were opposed to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so it was really actually difficult to get that fixed done. I think it took like 2 years or a year and a half to get done, because people didn't want to make the Republican tax code run more effectively. So that typo had significant impact on businesses and was not easy to fix after it was enacted.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. And yeah, I think that's yeah. And my next question that you kind of just answered would be like, how easy are the typos to fix? But that one seemed like it was really like a super big deal and affected probably lots of people.
Yes, there is points and times too, and it was a huge bill, and so maybe that's why it wasn't caught. But sometimes typos are caught maybe after you've introduced the bill, but before you've passed it, and that's easy to fix because then you can just do an amendment to it. And if it's just a perfecting amendment, that's not a big deal. Or maybe you can reintroduce the bill with your typo fixed. Or if the House passes one version and the Senate passes another, then the bill goes to conference and you can fix it in conference. So depending on when the typo is caught, it can be easier to fix. But if it goes into law, it's much harder.
Yeah, so for that one, when it went into actual law, like, did you guys have to like write an amendment to it, or just like scrap the...
No, people introduced a whole new bill to correct it. You can't, yeah. I mean, it's an amendment to, yes. So sometimes you introduce a whole new bill to amend legislation that's already in law. That's mostly what we do because we have so many base bills that currently exist. So even when we're doing the Higher Education Act, that was created in the 60s. So anytime we're reauthorizing it, we're actually amending that base law. But yeah, so that's what the new bills did, is it didn't amend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it amended our tax code in general.
Oh wow, okay, that's really interesting, and that's like kind of a good clear up. But I thought that was so interesting how you guys had to like reintroduce the entire bill just to fix the one typo. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so So I kind of like to segue into our next topic. So just I know we were briefly talking about the election before, but so now in terms of voters, so like what advice or tips do you have for voters at this time? Because I think that it's definitely a hard time, especially in the news. You're seeing all sorts of different things and ads flying out. So what kind of advice do you have for them to?
Yeah, absolutely. Our government, and something that's really great about the United States is incredibly transparent. And so, if there is a bill you really care about, or you want to see what kind of bills your member of Congress is introducing, you can go to the Library of Congress's website, and they kind of even have a filter system where you can look up your member of Congress and look up every single bill that they've introduced in any single Congress that they served in. If you want to know specifically about certain topics, you can also go onto that website and find, like, you can search, for instance, the word environment and your member of Congress and how many bills they co-sponsored or introduced on that topic, and you can kind of get a good list. You can also look at bills that were voted on the Senate floor or on the House floor, and you can look up how every single member voted on all of those issues. So what members have actually done is incredibly easily available to Americans. And so I highly recommend checking those things out. And, otherwise, just, go out and vote and do your research beforehand. And that's kind of the best advice I can really give. But everything is really accessible, and so I would definitely tell people to go look up what your member of Congress has done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very interesting because it's something that maybe not a lot of people even realized that they could go and look up all of the bills. But yeah, I agree with you in that it's really good that like the government's being super transparent about that, and you can kind of like see exactly what's been happening.
And you can see how many of them has actually been turned into law, because I think there is, and it depends on what kind of member of Congress or senator you want to have. And I will say too, if you've only served one term or if you're a freshman senator, it can be extremely difficult to get bills done. But there are members of Congress who have served for many, many terms who've never gotten a bill into law. And so at that point, you have to question, is it because they're too radical? Are you okay with that? Do you think that there should be a radical voice representing that specific side in Congress? Or do you want an effective legislator? Because there are people who are more effective at getting bills done than others. So that's also something. But I mean, you don't have to think that your member of Congress should be getting bills passed into law. Maybe you think that's their entire job, and so that's what you do want. But that's another thing that you can also look up about your member of Congress.
Yeah, actually, that's like super interesting because I think that we all just assume that legislators all get bills passed, but I think that's super interesting how like maybe they're kind of like serving a different role other than just like getting the bills to go through. Yeah. So I guess my next question along the lines of voting and all that kind of stuff would be like, how can people who aren't old enough to vote yet participate in kind of the election process or just government in general?
Well, they can always volunteer for a political campaign. I know from working on a campaign myself that we always need volunteers. So that can be door knocking and phone banking, which sounds lame, but even really high ranking people in a campaign end up doing it because it's so incredibly important. You literally feel like you're convincing people to vote for your candidate one vote at a time. But the other thing is, anybody can come and lobby Congress on, anything they want. They can ask for a meeting with either the senator, or member of Congress. But what's more likely is, if you really care about healthcare or environmental issues or foreign affairs, then go ahead and look up who the legislative assistant is that works on that issue. And if it's not available online, just call the office and ask for their email, and you can set up an appointment to meet with them over the phone right now. Or even, if you can't afford to go to Washington, D.C., you could set up a phone call with them anyways, or you could send a personal email. I always think that unique emails that go to the legislative assistant are a little bit more effective than we call them form letters, but you can go on websites and it'll say, fill out your information and it'll send a letter to your member of Congress on that issue. Well, we end up getting 30 identical letters and we know that you didn't write it. And so a lot of times we're not even sure that you know what's in the letter. So I think those unique emails that don't get sorted that way are always more effective. And that's to the member of Congress themselves, but also to their legislative assistants. So you can always lobby on something that is important to you. Lobby to the person who actually represents you. So either your member of Congress or your U.S. senators. And I know that we also, before Corona happened, we would have weekly coffee hours. So any constituent who was visiting DC once a week, we invited them to coffee and they got at least 5 minutes with the member themselves and then as much time as they wanted with the legislative assistant who handled the issue that they came in to talk about.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I think that's so cool how you guys are taking requests from even like younger people to lobby on an issue or come to one of your coffee hours. And it seems like there's a lot of opportunities for people to really be involved that maybe we're not all aware of. So I think that's really good to make it like readily known and available to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So I'd just like to kind of close this out a little bit by talking about something maybe a little bit more lighthearted. So you're on TikTok and all kinds of social medias, and you make all those cute little videos about the dogs in Congress and the snacks at all the like Congress offices. So do you have like a particular like favorite video or topic to make your TikToks about?
Well, the dogs were really popular, and so with the food, the problem is that it's been really difficult with COVID that members of Congress just aren't coming in anymore. And, to find out what food different offices have, before I could just walk into the office and figure out what they have in their front rooms. But a lot of these offices are closed. It's also just not a good idea to go from office to office right now. And a lot of them aren't getting replenishments of the food right now. But I love the dog videos because I'm a dog fan. As I've noted in my videos, I bring my dog Noki to work with me all the time. And when it comes to snacks and food, I think the best is probably Georgia because they have Coca-Cola fridges. I'm not a big soda fan, but they also have Dasani sparkling water, and I can drink sparkling water all day long. So I'm very jealous that they have that set up in their office.
Ooh, that is pretty cool to have all the sparkling water there. And you mentioned like it's all just like free for you to grab.
Yeah, I mean, it's really for the constituents that come in. It's like an opportunity for the members of Congress to show off what's manufactured in their home state or their home district. Sometimes, like I know, so in my office we do have sour punch straws, and it's because American licorice is in actually my hometown of LaPorte, Indiana, and they manufacture the sour punch straws there, which is kind of cool to tell people about. It's the same Cliff. We have Cliff Bars because Cliff Bars are manufactured in Indiana. Florida has Florida orange juice and Tropicana, which is fun. It's just a way to show off. Ohio has Dum Dums, and so they kind of market it as like this is a fine Ohio product for any visitors in their office. It's free for anyone who comes and visits the office as a way for the office to kind of show off what they proudly make in their state.
Wow, that's so cool. And that's so interesting. I'll have to tell my brother. He like loves sour punch straws and any of those kind of stuff. But yeah, so then I think that seems like just so fun though to kind of go around and see what everybody has.
Yes, there's a couple of cool things about Congress. I mean, I've also highlighted like the Senate candy drawer. A member of the U.S. Senate always has a drawer filled with candy that was started as a tradition years and years ago. Right now, Senator Toomey has it, and because he's from Pennsylvania, he stocks it with Hershey products. But whatever senator is in possession of the candy drawer, they always fill it with candy that's manufactured in their home state. And so there's a lot of fun things like that in Congress. And, tours of Congress are free. You just call your member of Congress, or you can even show up and get a huge group tour. And you'll learn a lot about these fun little nuances that occur up here. So.
Wow, yeah, that is super cool. And yeah, for anybody who's interested, definitely go on a tour. I don't know if they're offering those now because of COVID.
They're not offering them now during COVID, but once this passes, it's a popular thing. All offices provide them, and it's really cool that you can just walk into these government buildings, and they're so open and, again, transparent. It doesn't exist everywhere in the world, and so it's great that it exists here.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that's super cool and definitely something if you're in DC that you should go check out. Yeah, so I think I just have one like final kind of wrap up question for you, and that would be just like what kind of advice would you have for somebody who's just starting out trying to get a job at either like a member of representative's office or a senator's office? What kind of advice would you just have for them?
Well, if you're on the younger side, maybe you're still in school, I would definitely recommend interning. Summer internships are a little bit competitive, but if you can swing a semester in DC, then that's definitely when we have less interns and we need more of them. And you kind of can get, and the other thing too, like the entire month of August, we're not in session. So there's a lot more to do in the fall and in the spring. Definitely do those internships. And then when you're looking for a job, go to the people who saw your work as an intern and ask them for recommendations, ask them to look for job openings. There are job openings currently on the Senate website, and you can subscribe to a House bulletin where there are openings, but most openings aren't even advertised, and that's because when they are advertised, I know from personal experience, you will get thousands of applications. And so if you kind of advertise it in these smaller inner circles, you'll only get maybe 100 to 200 applications. And so that's a lot more manageable. And so you want to, they call it networking, but you basically want to meet with a lot of people, prove that you're responsible, prove that you can be relied on, and that's what you're really demonstrating in your internship, and then ask those supervisors to help you look for a job when it comes time to actually find one. And that's kind of my advice for people looking to work on the Hill.
Wow, definitely. Yeah, I think that's great advice to kind of go from like interning to then having like a paid position. Yeah. So I think that this is a good place to wrap up our discussion for today. Thank you so much for joining me today, Allison. I learned so much, and this was like such an interesting discussion for me, and it's going to be a great episode.
Great, I'm glad I could help.
A special thanks to Allison for joining me today. You can check out her on TikTok or Instagram at Feikes, and her dog, Noki, on Instagram at Noki the DC Corgi. You can check out this podcast on our website, www.fascinatingjobs.xyz, or on Instagram at fascinating_jobs_pod, or even on Twitter at fascinatingjobs. I'm always looking for fan questions, plus plenty of good discussion and updates about the show. Tag me with any questions or comments, and be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to this podcast to let us know you're enjoying it. And if you or someone you know has a fascinating job, email us at fascinatingjobspod@gmail.com for a chance to be a guest on the show. Thank you so much for listening and enjoying this podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode.